So it is Friday the 13th, 2018. I want to welcome you to Let's Talk Native on the LTN Radio Network. This program breaks all the rules for Native radio. No buffalo speeches, no mystic healing, and no special Indian prayers. We tackle the real issues facing Native people and look back at our glorious and our grave history, a tough look at where we're at now, and look forward to our ongoing battles for autonomy and our free and independent existence. Let's Talk Native is produced in association with Iroquois Promotions on the LTN Radio Network, streaming live from the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation, and simulcast on the Gwe, that's CKWE in Dandanega. You can find us at www.ltnradionet.com, and of course, we are streaming live on Facebook Live. I am John Kane, the show's host and producer, and I'm joined in studio by Ed Schindler on mic and Jake Proud on the board and operating our cameras. Our studio engineer is Kelly McMillan. Hey, look, I want to mention, first off, the opening song is Little White Lies by the Pappy Johns Band featuring Murray Porter on vocals. I wanted to mention that, because I haven't done it in a while, our shows are put into podcasts immediately after we broadcast. So, and you can find those podcasts. You can sign up for them. You can, make sure that you're getting these things delivered to you. You can find them on iTunes, on Stitcher, on TuneIn, and Google Play. So, if you're into catching podcasts because you're traveling and you want to be able to pick up things to listen on your own on your time, that is the way to do it. You can check out the Let's Talk Native podcast. So I want to mention that. All right. I posted on Facebook that I wanted to talk about the passport issues. And for those of you who are not aware, the Iroquois nationals have traveled to Israel. And that's a controversy all by itself, and I've talked about that issue, and Ed, you and I have discussed this a little bit, and I talked about it not only on this show but on my show in New York as well. Look, there's a lot of people who have been promoting what they call the BDS, which is boycott, divest, and sanction Israel for basically the crimes against humanity. These atrocities that they've been committing against Palestinians. And look, before I get into it too far, we understand that Palestinians and other Arab peoples and do not favor Israel. And many of them wish Israel didn't exist as a state and that kind of stuff. And we know that there have been actions and there are hostilities and aggression, that takes place both ways. But my issue with what's transpired over the last several months, and actually for years, I should say, is the asymmetric nature of the aggression that Israel perpetrates against people who are not armed the way Israel is, and sometimes not armed at all. Lately, we've seen, image after image, and this isn't just coming from biased news sources. This is Reuters. This is the, Associated Press. There are many independent news services that have documented Israel firing upon unarmed Palestinians, some under the age of 18, kids for all intents and purposes. Reporters have been shot. Medics have been shot. And Israel claims, well, we're not firing lethal shots. We're not aiming at their heads. We're aiming at places that are less than lethal. So whether you maim somebody or kill somebody, it's still a crime. It's still criminal. And these are sharpshooters. These are snipers that are taking some of these shots. So to say, well, we accidentally killed somebody, there's no accident when you're pulling a trigger and you got a high-powered rifle with a scope and you have the ability to shoot a quarter. You shoot a medic in the chest or in the back. I mean, look. So this is the stuff that has really riled people up, right? And this is why the BDS movement, this boycott, divest, sanction movement has gained traction. Now, many of us who questioned whether the Haudenosaunee should even accept an invitation by Israel, let alone whether the FIL, the Federation of International Lacrosse, should have granted Israel the hosting privileges for their world men's world championship. I mean, men's lacrosse world championship. many of us have questioned that issue, all right? And certainly we've raised the issue whether it's appropriate for a people who have stood up for environmental issues, stood up against aggression, stood up for indigenous peoples, should be participating in a event, a sporting event, a social event for all intents and purposes, at in a country that is currently in stark violation of several UN protocols, and has been openly condemned throughout the world for its aggression, against. Not just against Palestinians, but specifically against unarmed Palestinians that have been protesting the conditions in the Gaza Strip and conditions at the Trump-like border wall and at these barriers that prevent Palestinians from entering what essentially is as much their homeland, or actually probably more their homeland than, arguably anyway, than the Israelis who claim it. So the question about whether the Iroquois nationals should have gone to Israel in the first place is not really what I'm going to spend a great deal of time talking about tonight. Now, but what I do want to talk about is part of the motivation, one of the reasons that I was told. Yeah, I'm not saying from an official. This is kind of the buzz out there. Well, part of the reason that the Haudenosaunee agreed to go is because Israel was committed to honoring Haudenosaunee passports. Well, it turns out not so much. On Monday was when the Iroquois Nationals, and this is the team, the players, the coaching staff, and and the administrators of the team, were supposed to fly out of Toronto to go to Israel, and Israel did not issue travel visas. So Israel essentially did not recognize the Haudenosaunee passports, because what they were asking of the Canadian, I don't know if they got a State Department like the U.S. does, but the equivalent, I guess, immigration or customs or whatever their agency is. But what they were asking of the Canadian officials they were asking Canadian officials whether they recognized the Haudenosaunee passports. And Canada said no. I mean, let's be clear. Canada and the United States have balked continuously at the notion that any indigenous people, let alone the Haudenosaunee, have the right to create our own travel documents. In fact, Canada has seized several of these things, even when people are traveling from one part of Akwesasne that the U.S. claims is on their side of the border versus another part of Akwesasne which Canada claims is on their side of the border. But there have been individuals who had their Haudenosaunee passports seized, claiming that they were fraudulent identification documents and actually calling them fantasy documents. That was a headline a few years ago. Canada calls Haudenosaunee passports fantasy documents. So, I mean, for anybody to think that Canada was going to, out of the blue, just recognize Haudenosaunee passports, that's not the case. And whatever promise Israel made, where they claimed that they were going to, we'll recognize your passports, either they didn't understand what's involved when you claim to recognize a passport, or they just lied. They duped the Haudenosaunee. Now, look, maybe that's what what Israel had to do to be awarded these games in the first place. I don't know. There might have been something along those lines. Did Israel pretend that they would accept the Haudenosaunee coming so they could, I don't know, maybe gain some sort of cred towards indigenous peoples as they're firing upon 16-year-old Palestinians through a chain link fence and through razor wire? I don't know. But here's the deal: the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois Nationals, and their management and coaches and that kind of stuff intended to fly out in Toronto, and they couldn't. And so Israel and Canada started negotiating back and forth. Where were Haudenosaunee leaders in this thing? Where was Sid Hill and Oren Lyons? We don't know. I mean, and apparently the Federation of International Lacrosse, the FIL, whose tournament was awarded to Israel in the first place, they may have been involved in this. So the negotiations go back and forth. And the one thing Canada stood strongly on through the whole thing is we are not going to recognize Haudenosaunee passports. That's what they said in the beginning. And you know what? That's what they said in the end. So Monday they didn't fly out. Tuesday they didn't fly out. So finally a resolution was, or a solution to the problem was, was established. And that resolution was not recognizing the Haudenosaunee passports. What Canada agreed to do, which essentially was the same thing that the U.S. agreed to do back in 2010 when the Iroquois nationals couldn't go to Manchester, England. Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State, said, well, we'll grant a one-time waiver for the team to travel to Manchester, England. England said, wait a second. So you're not going to recognize their passports? And the United States says, no, we're going to grant them a one-time waiver. And England says, well, if you're not going to recognize their passports, then we're not going to issue a travel visa. That's not the way we operate. So Canada did that same thing. So Canada says, well, we'll issue a one-time waiver. We're not going to recognize their Haudenosaunee passports as legitimate travel documents, but we'll give them a waiver to travel without legitimate travel documents. And Israel says, oh, we can live with that. Well, the problem was, apparently so could the Haudenosaunee. Now, look, I understand the players don't really understand. They didn't understand. Many of the players didn't understand what the controversy was over going to Israel in the first place. They really didn't. I mean, I saw some of the interviews with even one of the Thompson boys, who was supposed to be one of these, premier athletes. He says, yeah, I read up on the whole Palestinian thing. Yeah, that's pretty wrong what's going on there. I mean, he didn't read up on it in advance. He just read up on it as the issue. Because, I mean, to be clear, and again, I'm not going to spend the whole show talking about this, the Iroquois Nationals was not sanctioned by the Haudenosaunee. In fact, in council, especially, and these were councils that were held in Six Nations, from what I understand, the traditional councils rejected endorsing or sanctioning the Iroquois Nationals to going to Israel. They said, no, we're not going to stand behind this. We don't think that they should go. But the way it kind of got left, well, it's really up to the athletes to go. So when they went, they weren't going as a sanctioned team from the Haudenosaunee. They were actually going almost as just freelance players playing for an organization. They weren't going there for all intents and purposes now. Even though, I'm not saying that we reject them as Haudenosaunee people. Look, we still stand behind that team. But the idea of them going to Israel, it turns out they weren't sanctioned by, certainly by the chiefs, and as we did polling, through my own Facebook accounts and stuff like that and my group pages, it turns out most people didn't think that the Haudenosaunee should send a team to Israel. So I wanted to put that out there. However, the powers that be in Onondaga certainly made sure every one of them had a Haudenosaunee passport, regardless of where they come from, whether they are, even though Onondaga is quick to say who is and isn't Haudenosaunee. I mean, I even heard somebody say, well, if real Senecas are from Tonawanda, like real Senecas aren't from Cattaraugus or Allegheny. Apparently, if you can play lacrosse, you can be a real Seneca. But if you're otherwise, that seems to be the line in the sand, I guess. And look, we know that there's a lot of bureaucracy that is associated with not just with the Haudenosaunee passports that come from places like Onondaga ultimately, but even the role that Tonawanda or other places play. Look, these guys can take years just to issue a red card, let alone to people who are not very, where there's no question involved, So when it comes to something like this, look, if you're a Division I lacrosse player in the college ranks, if you're a professional lacrosse player and you're native, if you're from one of the Six Nations, nobody cares whether you're Haudenosaunee in the longhouse sense of the word. Yeah, you're Haudenosaunee enough to play for the Iroquois Nationals. So, but again, I don't want to get too far off track here. But so this is the circumstance, and I guess the reason I wanted to talk about some of these players is, look, they're not only were they not aware of the circumstances involved in in the politics of the world, so to speak, in what's happening with international issues or international conflicts. But they don't really understand the Haudenosaunee passport thing either. In fact, I saw comments from Kenneth Deere, who is one of these figureheads that's always down in the at the UN or Geneva or someplace else. He says, "Well, we're not going to get into the details on how how this was resolved just now. We're just grateful that the team was able to go to Israel." Well, wait a second. Part of the selling of what the Iroquois nationals are is that they're traveling as a team representing us. I mean, there are sovereignty issues, there are autonomy issues, that they are going representing something different than than other teams that. Well, or actually, I take it back. No, they're going just like other teams. They're representing a nation of people, or a collection of nations in terms of the Six Nations. But so I saw some of these guys, even as they showed up in Israel, flashing out their Haudenosaunee passports. Now, the question is, did they get stamped? I mean, are they going to be stamped by Canada and Israel? Maybe Israel will stamp them. It might be just, I don't know, just like a rubber stamp, I guess, or symbolic, because that's not what got them on the plane in Toronto. So. Even my good friend, I have a good friend say, yes, they travel on Haudenosaunee passports. No, they didn't. They traveled on a waiver. They traveled on a waiver issued, the same kind of waiver that Hillary Clinton was offering 8 years ago. They're traveling on a waiver for insufficient travel documentation. That's what they're traveling on. And there's no question about it. Canada went at length. In fact, Canada went so far as to say, we're letting these guys travel, but don't anybody show up here with a Haudenosaunee passport and think you're going to travel just because we let these guys go to Israel. They made it clear. We're not honoring Haudenosaunee passports. This team and their entourage we're giving a waiver to travel, but we're not honoring Haudenosaunee passports. They made it very, very clear. Now, I haven't seen the letter. In fact, reporters in Canada asked for the Canadian officials to provide copies of what was agreed upon between Israel and Canada. And I don't know if our people had to sign something. I don't know if our people had to agree to something. But I think it's important at some point that we see the language of that. But that's the circumstance. And so coming out of the gate, I think it's really important to recognize, I know that's a tough word to use right now, but to recognize what Canada did here and what Israel did here, because they clearly have not recognized our rights to provide and to create our own travel documents. And this lies at the core of the problem. As we, even this many years into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we have countries all over the world who are refuse to recognize that we have any of these rights. Look, this isn't, I mean, when people talk about self-determination, and that's what the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says. And basically, those articles in that declaration are the minimum standard for the rights of Indigenous peoples. But clearly among those things have involved the right to travel and the right for us to self-determine and to have. I mean, they stop short of using words like sovereignty, which, as time goes on, I'm less comfortable with that word per se, as much as I am saying that we have the right to be free and independent, and assert that free and independent status that we had prior to white people washing up on our shores. But that's not what's happening here. And I think it's really important that as people want to rave about, oh, it's so great that we have this great team that can compete at the international level and is recognized by, throughout the world as, look, I think that would be great, but that's not what's happening. There was a lot of noise made back in 2010 when the men couldn't go to the same tournament that was hosted by in the United Kingdom. Wasn't so much noise made only 3 years ago when the women couldn't go. So between even dealing with the UK, because the UK was hosting the women's World Lacrosse Championship in 2015. That was at the same time that Onondaga and Syracuse and New York State was hosting the World Indoor Lacrosse Championship, and Onondaga was hosting some of the undercard games down on their territory, and it was a lot of pomp and circumstance, and first time ever, and all this historic nature of Onondaga playing a role in hosting this thing. But at the same time, they almost issued a gag order to the women who could not. They had to forfeit their position within the FIL. They had to forfeit their games in Manchester, England, because 5 years after 2010, in 2015, the issue still wasn't resolved. 8 years after 2010, the issue still isn't resolved. In fact, the solution was the same solution a couple of days ago on Monday, or essentially on Tuesday, that allowed them to travel on Wednesday. The same solution was offered up a few days ago that was offered up 10 years ago. And that solution did not involve recognizing Haudenosaunee passports. And, look, I understand there are powers that be who are jumping through all kinds of hoops. They're trying to meet the federal government's Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative standards, the Department of Homeland Security standards. They're trying to put electronic chips in the passports, and there's a lot of money being spent on this stuff. But for all that money, and for all of the claims that are being put into this thing, it's not being done. And I got to tell you, Ed, I call on the Seneca Nation, and I have before. When is the Seneca Nation going to step up and join in this fight? Because the Seneca Nation should not be relying on whether Tonawanda or Onondaga will issue them travel documents. The Seneca Nation should step up and play a role in issuing their own travel documents. I mean, I don't know what your thoughts are on that. I mean, I know the Seneca Nation went down that path on what they call the enhanced tribal cards. In fact, they signed on to that program, and that the enhanced tribal cards was a similar situation where the federal government was saying, we can, if you meet our standards, we'll give you a certain stamp of approval on your ID cards. So all of the money and all the burden was being placed on various Native peoples to create these, what they call enhanced tribal cards. But what they really were, they were like an enhanced driver's license that the states issue, or they were an identification card that the federal government that would meet the federal government's approval. And among those, the 5 requirements that were necessary for an enhanced tribal card to meet the, and I call it, it's the Western Hemisphere Travel Initiative. Some people call it WITI. I call it WHITey because it is. So in order to meet WHITey standards for these enhanced travel cards, they had to have an expiration date, which is, something we should have on our cards anyway, right? If we're going to have cards, an expiration date. But they also had to have a photograph that would enable data to be pulled off of this type of photograph to put the data points of the photograph into a facial recognition database. And in fact, well, I'll get into it a little bit more, but so the photo had to be formatted in such a way that it would work with the federal government's facial recognition database. There also had to be a scannable strip on the card, and so that scannable strip would, when you scan it, it would pull the electronic data associated with with that photograph. It also wanted to have an RFID chip. Now, what an RFID chip is, it's essentially a chip that, when it's ignited or when it's energized or activated through sending a signal, would give a signal back. So you don't even have to pull a card out of your wallet. In fact, you could either just hold it up and it could be scanned at a distance, or if you just had it available, if it wasn't shielded in your pocket somehow, you could be tracked, with an RFID chip. So it had, some means to track your location through this RFID chip on a card. The fifth thing, and this is what was really the killer on this thing. The fifth thing that was required was citizenship. And they weren't talking about Seneca Nation here. They're talking about the United States or Canada. So on an enhanced tribal card, what they wanted to put, for, especially for those of us like Haudenosaunee, if we're going to do these things, they wanted to put an American flag up in the corner or a Canadian flag up in the corner. And that was going to, at a glance, tell anybody who picked up that card, oh, you're an American citizen. No, we're not. We're Seneca. We're Mohawk. We're Oneida. We're Onondaga. We're Ganyakahaga. We're Onyotaaga. But no, they said no. We need to. This card has to represent a declaration of citizenship, either to the U.S. or Canada, a real country. So, and the Seneca Nation actually went down the path, but hardly anybody. I mean, they lost a ton of money doing this enhanced tribal card. In fact, they may have even bailed on the whole project, because I think the only people who even signed up, some of them were like Seneca Nation officials and that kind of stuff. But it not only was it a debacle from the onset, but as a travel document, Canada said, well, we're under no requirement to recognize an enhanced tribal card. Well, we'll recognize an enhanced driver's license, but we're under no obligation to recognize an enhanced tribal card. So the whole idea that you could use this card to cross the border, here's what you could use that card for. If you had an approved enhanced tribal card from the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security, from Whitey, if you were in Canada already, you could use that card to return home. That's all it would do. Canada didn't necessarily have to honor it, but the United States Border Services would. I mean, that's the craziness of it. Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour. So, again, I want to kick this around, Ed. I know I kind of was setting the stage here, but let's have that conversation. Let's talk about what this passport issue means. And if you've got a different opinion on this thing, by all means, I'd like to hear it, because the story isn't ringing true to the way it's being purported by others. So, and I'm getting my information from legitimate news sources, even from some of the native people who are advocating this as a great solution. They're fully acknowledging that, look, Canada said that no, we're not recognizing the passports. We're going to issue a waiver. So we're at the bottom of the hour. We'll take a break and come back, and we'll chew this up a little bit. I'm John Kane. I got Ed Schindler in studio, and this is Let's Talk Native. All right, thanks for coming back. Yeah, there's some trouble in the wigwam, trouble in the longhouse, trouble everywhere. Hey, look, one of the reasons I opened up with Little White Lies because I think there was some lying going on, and whether it was from Israel in their false claim that they were going to recognize our passports or whatever. There's a bit of a problem there. But before we get into it, let me go ahead and give acknowledgement to my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses, Eric White and ERW Enterprises, Legacy 420 and Tanzania, Mike General and with his Mikey G's and Mikey's Emporium. And I want to thank individuals like my good friend Ed Schindler who do contribute to the show. My friends Cynthia Trice, Roger Jock, Neville Spring, and many others who may not be helping now, but who have helped in the past and who have helped us get to what we're at now, which is our 9th year of broadcasting in one way or another. Let's Talk Native. I also want to thank Unity Stream and Apache RadioNet for providing our streaming, and thank CKWE, the radio station in Tanzania, for the simulcast and the rebroadcast of this show, as well as our internet partners, Netroots Radio, Real People's Media, and Indigenous Resistance Radio. These are the some of the internet networks for carrying Let's Talk Native on their networks. Look, I also want to thank, again, the group pages that allow us to post our Facebook live stream on their group pages. And again, I want to reiterate the fact that we put our shows into a podcast. We put our shows on SoundCloud, so you can just go to SoundCloud and catch the audio. We and from SoundCloud they go up as podcasts for iTunes, Stitcher, TuneIn, and Google Play. And of course, we also take the Facebook live stream video and then put it up with a little bit of editing, put it up on YouTube, on our YouTube channel, which is Let's Talk Native TV. So any number of ways to catch what we're talking about. And in any of these places, you can also weigh in. I mean, you can offer a comment. You can, rate the show. You can, criticize the opinion that I'm expressed, or call me out if I get facts wrong or whatever else. Or share the show. By all means, share this conversation because we have to address this thing. Ed, again, I've talked to some of the guys on council. Why doesn't Seneca Nation finally address this travel document issue? I even suggested, and I know this isn't a great solution, that look, if the Seneca Nation isn't prepared to create a Seneca Nation passport, then maybe the thing to do is to say, look, to the federal government, we understand that you guys have the infrastructure for travel documents that we don't. Our problem is, just like with the ETCs, the enhanced travel cards, we don't want, we reject the notion that we have to claim U.S. citizenship to have you accept our documents. It's the same thing with a passport. I personally have said I wouldn't have a problem with traveling with U.S. passport if I didn't have to claim to be a U.S. citizen to get one. I mean, look, I understand what the world around me here, and I understand that a U.S. passport is more recognizable. But if we could have language even within a U.S. passport that says we are just utilizing the infrastructure of the colonial state around us, essentially, but that we maintain our autonomy and our distinction. As long as I don't have to say that I'm a U.S. citizen, as long as I can maintain that I'm Ongwe, that I'm Gunyagahaga, that I'm Haudenosaunee, if I can maintain that in these in this debate, in these conversations, then I'm okay. It's a compromise that I think I would be willing to do.
It's not much different from the compromise of using a New York State driver's license.
We could make that argument. Although nobody has to, you don't have to claim to be a U.S. citizen to have a New York State driver's license.
Qualified to be a driver.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know what are your thoughts on even this notion that Canada whether Israel duped us or I can't imagine Israel not being sophisticated enough in their understanding of travel documentation to not see what was going to happen here.
There's Israel, Canada, United States, England. They can do whatever they're going to do, and it doesn't matter what we may think about it. What should matter is what we think about is what are the Haudenosaunee doing, okay? Because That's what's going to make a difference. Is the Haudenosaunee.
Well, and I agree with you on that, and that's why I'm wondering what this agreement was. And I was talking to somebody from APTN, who which is a Canadian television network or news network. They couldn't get a copy of the letter from the Canadian officials and give it to them. So now they've got to go through the Canadian version of a Freedom of Information Act and submit a file for the information. But I think, obviously it should be a matter of public record, but Canada didn't necessarily want to come clean, and I don't know if, again, did any Haudenosaunee officials or team management get a copy of this letter? I think you're right, because you're right, Ed. What are we doing about this? And frankly, this isn't a new issue. Like I said, we got a lot of international recognition in 2010, and in fact, that debacle with the Iroquois Nationals not being able to go to Manchester, England in 2010 was playing out at the same time that the United States under Barack Obama was hosting consultation meetings and at the State Department and other places to revisit the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And again, for whatever reason, that subject never came up. I was there. I went to those consultations in Washington. While this was days before this would turn into the issue, and I might have been the only person who even brought up things like travel documents in the conversation. So you're right. This is the question. And when I see Kenneth Deere, who is supposed to be from Kahnawake, who's supposed to be representing the Haudenosaunee, saying, "Well, we don't need to discuss how they resolve this thing right now. We don't need to look at that." Well, it's like, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, right?
Yeah.
Just we got them on the plane and they're going. That's all that matters. Well, no, that's not all that matters, because that's not. The whole idea of having this team compete against other nations was the fact that we're sending them there as a nation, and to suggest that we can't provide our own travel documents for them it's hypocritical, and especially if we're okay with it.
Yes, that's the problem I see, is that we're okay with it, and that it has to be something that the people become more aware of, the Haudenosaunee become more aware of, because the fact of the matter is, the longer we let it slide, the longer we let it become not our issue, their issue, the more it becomes, self-evident that we are not our own nation. We are not our own people.
Which is part of the reason that I say, while I think it's a compromise to use their travel documents, I still think we should fight for the right to create our own travel documents. And you know what? I don't believe that the standard that the United States is trying to create for travel documents is the standard that we have to meet. We should look at the international standard, because I know, there was a lot of concern, if you recall, when the U.S. was trying to go to electronic passports. Some of the other countries said, no, we're more comfortable with paper because paper can't be hacked. So the idea of stamping, a passport book, but there are a lot of countries who said, no, the old system worked fine. But here's the thing: you do have to have back office. You have to have infrastructure. You have to have somebody who, when a country looks at your passport, there's got to be a number that somebody can call and somehow verify, that the document is legitimate. So I understand there's infrastructure involved, but I don't know that we necessarily have to follow the Department of Homeland Security's and the witty or whitey standards that they've tried to establish. I guess as long as they don't conflict with with our autonomy, I think that's fine. But no, I think, and this is where other nations, and not just certain people from like Kenneth Deere or Oren Lyons, who managed to get down in front of the UN and get an audience down there. I think we need to, or Betty Lyons, I think we need to get some people who are going to assert a stronger position that we have a legitimate right to create travel documents that the international community should be obligated to recognize. And I don't think that's an unreasonable look. We're not asking for somebody to give us something, But there's no reason that we shouldn't be able to go to Geneva, or we shouldn't be able to go to different places to make our case for some of the atrocities. One of the things that is clear, and I've mentioned this before, if you got the Supreme Court of the United States that is still willing to cite the doctrine of Christian discovery as the basis for land use, land claims, and jurisdictional issues, when the rest of the world has condemned the doctrine of Christian discovery, I mean, it's condemned in the third affirmation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One of the things that is clear is we cannot get a fair trial. And, we've talked about this too, Ed. Anytime we end up in a circumstance, especially a criminal court, where we're being charged with something, whether it's something as benign as a speeding ticket or something, or tax issues or whatever else, what invariably happens is the federal government or the courts, state, local, and feds, they would rather throw out a case, dismiss a case, than allow a verdict to go in our favor. And why? Because they don't want to establish a precedent. That's the same thing with this one-time waiver. So rather than recognizing our documentation, they'll say, no, we're not recognizing your documentation, but we'll create a special circumstance where we'll let you travel without legitimate documentation. And, we're going to run around and say, oh, yeah, we won. It's the same thing that happens in court cases. I know people who have avoided, whether it's, fines from the IRS or whether it's speeding tickets, run around saying, oh, yeah, I beat it in court. No, you really didn't. What happened is you put up maybe a very legitimate argument, but in the end, they threw your court case out. You didn't win. You didn't get acquitted. You didn't win at trial. You basically put up a strong enough argument that they threw the case out. So no precedent ever gets established. That's the challenge that we have with this stuff. I mean, and I know that you helped Matt with this with a speeding ticket. Maybe last year or the year before, and that was the problem. They knew that they couldn't make a solid case, and in fact, they said, "Well, we don't have the authority to rule on this thing." Yes, you do. You have the absolute lower, and that's the way things get up into the higher courts. Lower courts make a ruling, and if a lower court said, "We clearly don't have jurisdiction here," then, all right, now everybody can use that case as precedent. But instead, what did the judge say? In the interest of justice, we're dismissing this case.
Right, but he's only dismissing Matt.
Yeah, just Matt's case. And, and of course, now Matt's, got his daughter in with a ticket here on the res. So we keep going through the same thing over and over again. And this is, I'm sorry, folks, but this is a part of the oppression. And this is, so again, this failure, to recognize our right for travel documents and to assert our own self-determination is what we go through.
And I feel it's important to look at Israel. Israel claims they had a Holocaust. Israel claims that they've suffered genocide. And there's no one that can really argue against that. Okay?
Yeah, there are people that do, and they're deniers. But that's not the issue here. The issue is that they want to make it sound like they have a monopoly on misery.
They're the only ones who ever suffered it.
Yeah.
And yet they're talking to us saying we don't have the right to travel because Canada won't recognize it. Well, Canada and the United States don't recognize the genocide they carried out and still carry out.
I mean, even in Canada, when during that whole Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools, and Murray Sinclair, who's Native, who sat at the head of this commission, what did he say? Everybody raved. Oh yeah, he said the word genocide. You know what he said? He said the residential schools represented cultural genocide. So again, one of these things where we put a precursor, we put a word in front of a word. So we don't say sovereignty, we say tribal sovereignty. We don't say nation, we say a tribal nation. We don't say genocide, we say cultural genocide. There's no such thing. The international community, the international law does not recognize a thing called cultural genocide. If you try to eliminate somebody by wiping out their culture, that's still genocide. That meets the definition. If you take whatever actions you take that are intend to eliminate a people as a distinct people, you don't just have to kill people to do that. Assimilation is genocide. Those residential schools were clearly representations of genocide, not some soft-pedaled other thing that doesn't even exist, is this idea of cultural genocide. I heard somebody else say, oh, they're committing paper genocide. Look, whether they do it through documentation, it doesn't, by saying paper genocide, you're suggesting that somehow it's less, less egregious, right? And it isn't. Because if I say on paper you don't exist, what happens is, that we talk about this. That's what this whole undocumented immigrant thing is, right? It's this idea that by paper you can say where somebody is a lawful or unlawful individual. That's a travesty. That's just injustice.
And they claim the right to literally take the children away from them.
Yeah, and that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing now. And I by the way, I did post something on Facebook, and I encourage people to weigh in on it. I don't understand how a government could separate children from parents, take a baby from a mother, and not document the relationship between that baby and a mother. And I don't care if you got to do it through photographs, if you got to do it through an assigned number, or whether you got to do it through, again, tracking location. Look, you're putting them in a freaking cage, for crying out loud. They're not exactly getting away. Or whether you do it through fingerprints, or again, DNA, whatever it's got to be. The idea that someone's got to draw blood to prove that they're, to be reunited with their parent is crazy. But the idea that the United States will do that, and again, it fits right in line with this whole thing, because it has to do with the idea of documentation, undocumented, documented, waivers, and that kind of stuff. This thing is really, really bizarre. And the thing to be clear, again, calling out Israel on this thing, the whole idea that Israel would recognize the Haudenosaunee passports when clearly Palestinians can't travel within their own homeland, that to me is the height of hypocrisy.
There's, I don't know how many people heard about what we were talking about last week, but that's what's got to be started to be established within the world community. Okay, we talked about listening, we talked about comprehension, empathy, patience, camaraderie, commitment.
Basic communications, yeah.
And communication. And not only with each other, but within the self. Okay? Those are things which the world needs. We have to start practicing those things, not just learning what they are, but actually practicing them. Okay? Because if the Israelis are going to recognize a Holocaust that occurred to their people in just a few generations ago, then they should understand that it's not the only one.
They're the ones that are quick to condemn Holocaust deniers. Yet they seem to be denying the Holocaust that they and their allies are perpetrating against others. Whether it's what the United States and Canada and other European nations did to indigenous people in the Western Hemisphere, or in Africa, or in India, or other places, or in the Arab countries that they committed so many atrocities to over the years, or whether it's what Israel is doing to Palestinians. It's one thing to sit there and call out people for being Holocaust deniers, but if you're among them because you just want to deny anybody else's Holocaust or anybody else's a genocide, that's the pot calling the kettle black.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a problem.
And that's just the refusal to communicate. And to communicate, you have to listen, you have to empathize, you have to...
Well, and the height of communication, or the height of communication is by sorting things out, the ultimate goal is to achieve consensus. And that's what our culture is. That's the way our system works. It's about creating a process that allows you to to get to consensus on issues that you're that are causing a conflict. And so the whole idea, and I think it's important, again, understanding what the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People says. There's the one line that is repeated over and over and over again is this notion of free, prior, and informed consent. That's what the international community has said of indigenous people, is that to the colonial or settler states that are interacting with indigenous peoples, that they must get free, prior, informed consent from people. And in fact, what does the United States say in their Declaration of Independence? They say that a true and just government derives its power from the consent of the governed. Well, for one thing, we aren't your governed. Or you aren't governing us. That's the whole idea of self-determination and self-governance. And when you make this argument that we have to get your documents, we never consented to that. I mean, even presidents like a Barack Obama, when he issued an executive order that said any executive department or agency that adopted a policy that had what he called tribal implications, he required by executive order that consultation with the affected tribes, as he called us, was required. He never said consent. He never said free prior and informed consent. He said just consultation. That consultation doesn't meet the standard for communications that you're talking about.
No.
That just means somebody can check a box and, well, we had a hearing and we heard you. We didn't agree with anything you said and we didn't take any action relating to anything you said, but we gave you the opportunity to consult with us. No, consultation is not the same thing as consent. And I think that's, again, part of the problem that exists here. And look, our people, and I heard some people have already weighed in and said, look, the Haudenosaunee should not have accepted this one-time waiver. They should have called out Israel and said, look, you promised, you assured us you would recognize our Haudenosaunee passports. And you know what? Canada couldn't have kept them from leaving to go to Israel. All Canada could have done, I mean, and if they're holding us hostage in the U.S. or Canada, that's a whole other issue. But for these host countries, whether it was the UK or whether it's Israel, say, yeah, but we can't accept you. We can't give you a travel visa unless the governments. We're recognizing the oppressive governments around you. We're not recognizing you. We're saying, well, Canada accept your travel documents to receive you back. So I mean, we'll put up the argument about getting back home. The question is, will these countries finally have the courage to stand up in the way that they should? But you know what? You're not going to get Israel to cross the U.S. and Canada, and that's the fallacy of all this thing. And shame on the Haudenosaunee leadership or the leadership of this team for being played like this. You know, we're running out of time here. We're almost, and I don't know if anybody has a score on a second game. I know the first game for all this debacle, the Iroquois Nationals did get to travel on Wednesday, and of course it's like a 6-hour difference from here to Israel. It's quite a time difference. So these guys had to fly in, get there on Thursday, recover from jet lag, and then play the top seeded team in the tournament, play the United States. And of course, you know, look, our guys held their own for a while. We've got some very talented, players on the team, but it ran out of gas. And although they stayed pretty even with them for 3 quarters, in the end, the United States almost doubled their score, beat them 17-9. And and look, and that's a shame. I mean, that's a shame. And I don't know if. Again, I don't know if they've played a second game now, and I know they do. I don't know the makeup of the tournament, but I know they'll have to play several times before they ever get to a medal round, and we'll see if they make it there or not. But and it's a shame. I mean, I know a lot of people say, in light of all of this controversy, it'd be great if they went there and then they won the whole thing outright. Well, and again, you have to put some things in perspective. We've got a population, if you counted everybody who's considered Haudenosaunee, we might come up to 100,000 people altogether. Might. Probably not quite that. But we're going to draw an elite squad of athletes to compete at the international level in the highest bracket, by the way. This is the blue division, which is the high, against teams that are drawing their athletes from from populations in the millions, 300 million people in the United States. We're going to draw a team from a population of less than 100,000 to compete against a team drawing drawing talent from 300 million. Yeah, it's a little bit of an uphill battle. So, look, I wish these guys luck. I hope they travel safe, and I hope they make it back home safe. But they never should have gone. And this Haudenosaunee passport thing just makes the debacle even worse. Hey, just before we almost out of time, and I'd be remiss if I didn't at least mention that Red Fawn Fallis did get sentenced to 57 months in prison, in federal prison, for her arrest and the alleged use of a firearm at the Standing Rock water protectors camp. And and it's a travesty. The whole thing with both her romantic involvement with a federal informant, a guy who turned out to be a federal informant, it being his gun, and again her being targeted for arrest, knowing that she had his gun. It was an ugly mess, and it's really sinister what the federal government did. And it's unfortunate that she felt pressured to plead out. She didn't lose in trial. She pled guilty to a lesser charge, and she's already spent 20 months in prison. She'll be spending another 37 months in prison, and that's really too bad. So I wanted to mention that. All right. Hey, we'll be back here on Monday. We'll see what transpires more with this debate over this passport issue, and perhaps we'll have more on it then. So we'll talk to you then. This is John Kane with Ed Schindler, and this is Let's Talk Native. We'll see you on Monday. Yahweh.
Yahweh.